There are crimes that shake a community to its core, but when that crime happens within the sacred walls of a church, it shakes not only the people but their very faith. This is the story of a brutal murder, a crime so sinister that it left an entire religious community haunted by betrayal, doubt, and the darkest of secrets. On the day before Easter in 1980, the Mercy Hospital Chapel in Toledo, Ohio, was meant to be a place of quiet reflection and prayer. Instead, it became the scene of a horrifying discovery, one that would forever change how the faithful viewed the sanctity of their spiritual space. Sister Margaret Ann Pahl, a nun devoted to service, was found brutally murdered inside this sacred chapel. Her body lay on the cold floor, strangled and stabbed repeatedly. But it wasn't just the violence that sent shockwaves through the community, it was the manner in which she was killed. The stab wounds were arranged in a cruciform pattern, mimicking the shape of a cross. This ritualistic nature, combined with the timing just before Easter, the most sacred time in the Christian calendar, suggested something far more disturbing than a random act of violence. Toledo, Ohio, in 1980 was not prepared for such horror. The city, with its quiet religious communities, was thrust into a state of confusion and fear. People whispered about the implications of the murder. How could something so dark, so evil, happen inside a church? The timing of Sister Margaret Ann's death, occurring right on the edge of Easter celebrations, only deepened the sense of unease. For the nuns and priests who lived and worked at Mercy Hospital, this was more than just a tragic event. It was a violation of their sacred trust, an act that felt as though evil itself had entered their midst. And while the police were quick to launch an investigation, no one could have predicted how long it would take to uncover the truth behind the death of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl, or how deeply intertwined the truth would be with the very institution that claimed to offer protection and guidance. Before the tragedy that forever marked her name, Sister Margaret Ann Pahl was known as a woman of deep faith and quiet strength. Born in 1910, she dedicated her entire life to the service of God and the Catholic Church, embodying the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that defined her path as a nun. Her journey led her to the Sisters of Mercy, where she served for over 45 years. To those around her, she was more than just a nun. She was a pillar of devotion and care within the community. Sister Margaret Ann spent much of her career working at Mercy Hospital in Toledo, where she served not only as a spiritual guide, but also as an active contributor to the daily functioning of the hospital. Her responsibilities extended far beyond prayer. She helped organize religious ceremonies, provided comfort to the sick, and ensured that the chapel remained a place of peace and reflection for both staff and patients. It was a role that perfectly suited her, blending her love for the church with her desire to serve those in need. Though reserved in nature, Sister Margaret Ann was well respected by her peers. Fellow nuns admired her unwavering commitment to her duties, while the priests she worked alongside valued her quiet but powerful presence. She wasn't the type to seek attention or recognition, yet her influence was felt in every corner of the hospital. Over the years, she had formed close bonds with those in the clergy, including priests like Father Gerald Robinson, who was known to work with her on various religious services. Despite her strong connections within the religious community, Sister Margaret Ann's personal life remained deeply private. She was a woman who found joy and fulfillment in the routines of her work and prayer, never straying from her calling. In many ways, she was the embodiment of what a nun should be: humble, faithful, and always in service to others. But perhaps it was her quiet nature that made the horror of her death all the more shocking. To those who knew her, the thought of someone harming such a devoted servant of God was unimaginable. How could a life spent in devotion, filled with acts of kindness and service, end in such brutality? And what could have possibly driven someone to commit such an unspeakable act against her? The questions surrounding her death would hang heavily over the community for years, but one thing remained clear: Sister Margaret Ann Pahl's legacy of service and devotion would not be forgotten, even as the darkness surrounding her murder continued to cloud the halls of Mercy Hospital.
The murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl sent immediate shockwaves through the religious community and the city of Toledo. For a nun to be killed within the sacred space of a chapel, and in such a brutal, ritualistic manner, was unthinkable. The day after her body was discovered, the mood at Mercy Hospital was one of deep mourning and fear. The questions weighed heavily: who could have done this and why? But there were no immediate answers.
As the police arrived at the scene, it became clear that this was not a typical crime. The religious setting, the cruciform stab wounds, and the timing just before Easter pointed to something far more sinister than a random act of violence. The investigators were met with confusion from the start. The chapel showed no signs of forced entry, which suggested that the killer had access to the building, or worse, that it was someone from within the community itself. Despite their best efforts, the early stages of the investigation offered few leads. The crime scene was meticulously analyzed, but no definitive fingerprints or clear evidence initially surfaced. The police began interviewing staff at the hospital, including the priests and nuns who worked closely with Sister Margaret Ann, but nothing seemed to point directly to a suspect. The nuns were distraught and the priests were in disbelief. How could such a horrific act take place in the house of God, and who among them might be responsible? As rumors spread throughout the religious community, so did theories about the nature of the crime. The method of the killing, particularly the way the wounds were arranged in the form of a cross, immediately sparked speculation that this was no ordinary murder. Some whispered that it might have been a ritualistic killing, a dark and twisted act connected to religious symbolism. Others suggested that it could have been a personal vendetta, perhaps involving someone who held a grudge against Sister Margaret Ann or the church itself. But nothing was certain, and the lack of solid evidence left both the investigators and the community grasping for answers. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted. The murder of a nun, especially in such a public and religious setting, demanded justice. The city of Toledo, especially its Catholic community, grew increasingly uneasy, waiting for the police to make a breakthrough. As days turned into weeks, frustration grew. The police combed through every possible lead, but none seemed to bring them closer to finding the person responsible. The case began to stall, and whispers of the murder faded into the background, overshadowed by the passage of time. Yet, for those within the church, the fear lingered. Was it someone among them? Could the killer be hiding in plain sight, protected by the very institution that had been violated? These questions hung heavily over the investigation, which, despite its promising start, soon found itself mired in dead ends and uncertainty. It would be over 2 decades before any real progress was made, but the chilling nature of the crime left a mark that would not fade easily from the memory of those who had known and loved Sister Margaret Ann Pahl. At the center of the quiet and tightly knit community of Mercy Hospital was Father Gerald Robinson, a priest who had dedicated much of his life to serving the Catholic Church. Born in 1938, Robinson had entered the priesthood in his early 20s, following what appeared to be a deep and unwavering commitment to his faith. By the time of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl's murder in 1980, Father Robinson had been working at the hospital for several years, providing spiritual care to the patients, offering Mass, and serving as a key religious figure for both the staff and the residents of the community. Father Robinson's role was essential. He conducted religious services at the hospital's chapel, provided confession to the nuns and staff, and often worked alongside Sister Margaret Ann in organizing religious events. Despite their professional closeness, Robinson was not widely known for having a particularly warm relationship with her. Their interactions, while respectful, were reportedly marked by tension at times, though this was not uncommon in the strict hierarchies of religious institutions. Nonetheless, no one could have predicted that Robinson's name would one day be linked so closely to the horrific crime that shook their community. In the early days of the investigation, Father Robinson was naturally among the many clergy members questioned by the police. Given his close proximity to the scene of the murder and his role within the chapel, the investigators wanted to leave no stone unturned. Robinson answered their questions cooperatively, explaining his duties on the day of the murder and his usual interactions with Sister Margaret Ann. At first glance, there was nothing particularly suspicious about him. He was just one of many priests in the hospital, and although the crime had occurred in his place of work, there was no immediate evidence that pointed directly at him. In fact, early on, Robinson's involvement was treated as procedural. The investigators had no strong reason to believe that a respected Catholic priest would commit such a heinous crime, especially in such a sacred space. His demeanor during the interviews was calm and composed, offering little reason for suspicion. The police were more focused on finding leads that could suggest an outsider or an individual with a clear motive. But as time passed and the investigation stalled, Robinson's name was not forgotten. His presence in the hospital and his connection to the chapel placed him in the orbit of the crime, even if the police didn't immediately view him as a serious suspect. In the religious community, where he was still leading services and performing his duties as a priest, there was no visible sign that anyone believed Father Robinson could be capable of such darkness. He continued his work, blending into the daily routines of Mercy Hospital, while the horrific crime remained unsolved. It would take over 2 decades before the name Father Gerald Robinson would once again resurface in connection with the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl, this time under circumstances far more chilling and undeniable. But in those early days of the investigation, Father Robinson was simply another figure in the church, a man of God who had lived his life in service, now caught in the shadow of an unthinkable crime, but not yet the focus of suspicion. For over 2 decades, the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl remained a haunting cold case. The initial investigation had yielded few solid leads, and the passage of time only deepened the mystery. But by the early 2000s, new advances in forensic science and DNA technology offered the possibility of breathing new life into the case. What had once been beyond the reach of investigators was now within their grasp. Science had evolved, and with it, the tools to uncover long buried truths. The turning point came when detectives, still haunted by the unsolved crime, decided to re examine the evidence. They were determined to see if the forensic advancements of the time could shed new light on what had remained in the shadows. The evidence collected back in 1980 had been meticulously preserved, and this would prove crucial. Among the key pieces were the altar cloth and the habit Sister Margaret Ann had been wearing at the time of her murder, both of which had traces of blood and potential DNA. When these materials were subjected to modern DNA testing, the results were telling. Though the technology of the early 80s had been limited, the new methods were able to extract and analyze genetic material with far greater accuracy. And it wasn't just the DNA analysis that reopened the case. Other forensic techniques, including blood spatter analysis and tool mark comparisons, were re-examined with a fresh, more sophisticated approach. As detectives pieced together the forensic puzzle, one name began to surface with chilling clarity: Father Gerald Robinson. He had long been a figure in the background, initially questioned but never fully suspected. But now, with the aid of modern science, investigators uncovered a disturbing link between Robinson and the crime scene. It wasn't just the DNA that raised eyebrows, it was also the re-examination of the murder weapon. Though never definitively identified at the time of the murder, forensic experts began to suspect that the weapon used to stab Sister Margaret Ann may have been an altar candle holder, something that would have been easily accessible to those familiar with the chapel, like Father Robinson. Further scrutiny of the wounds revealed patterns consistent with a sharp, pointed object that could match such an item. And as forensic investigators revisited the evidence, the circumstantial connections to Father Robinson grew stronger. The DNA results, while not a definitive match in the way modern testing might produce today, were enough to suggest that Robinson could not be ruled out. The reopening of the case sent shockwaves through the Toledo community, especially within the Catholic Church. Father Gerald Robinson had been leading a relatively quiet life in the years following the murder, still performing his duties as a priest. But now, with these new forensic findings, the focus of the investigation shifted squarely onto him. In the 2000s, the tools that could have cracked the case in the 80s had finally caught up to the crime. What had been a cold case now burned with the heat of suspicion, and Father Robinson, once a peripheral figure in the investigation, became the prime suspect. The weight of the new evidence would ultimately lead to his arrest, but it was the advancements in forensic science that first gave detectives the tools to bring long-awaited answers to a case that had gripped the community for more than 20 years. It was the spring of 2004 when the quiet life of Father Gerald Robinson came to an abrupt and shocking end. For years, he had served as a priest, his name slipping into the background after the brutal murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl. But now, more than 2 decades after her death, Father Robinson found himself at the center of a storm, arrested and charged with the murder of the very nun he had once served alongside. The news of his arrest sent ripples of disbelief through the community of Toledo and beyond. For many, the idea that a Catholic priest, a man sworn to serve God, and the Church could be responsible for such a heinous crime was almost too much to bear. The Catholic Church, already shaken by scandals in other parts of the world, now faced the grim reality that one of its own was being accused of murder. The arrest of Father Robinson created a media frenzy. Journalists swarmed the courthouse, and the headlines painted a story that felt more like fiction than reality. Priest arrested for ritualistic murder, satanic ritual, or church cover up. The public, hungry for answers, watched as the church struggled to reconcile the horror of the crime with its long standing traditions of trust and faith. The arrest of Father Robinson was not just a legal development, it was a rupture in the heart of the community. For those who had known him for years, who had attended his masses and sought his guidance, this turn of events was unthinkable. Many refused to believe that a man of God could have committed such a vile act, but as investigators began to lay out the evidence against him, the case that had baffled Toledo for so long started to come into focus. At the heart of the prosecution's case was the altar candle holder, which was now believed to be the murder weapon. Forensic experts had re-examined the wounds on Sister Margaret Ann's body, and the patterns suggested that an object like a candle holder, commonly found in the chapel, had been used to inflict the stab wounds. This detail, combined with the fact that Father Robinson had easy access to such items within the chapel, formed the cornerstone of the case against him. But the candle holder was not the only damning piece of evidence. The forensic advances of the early 2000s had allowed investigators to extract and analyze DNA from the scene, and while the results weren't conclusive enough to definitively place Robinson at the scene, they were enough to cast a heavy shadow of suspicion over him. Additionally, investigators revisited witness testimonies and behavioral patterns. Some recalled that Robinson had been unusually calm in the days following Sister Margaret Ann's murder, while others pointed out his strained relationship with the victim. The cumulative weight of the evidence, though largely circumstantial, was enough to bring Father Robinson to trial. His arrest was the first step in what would become one of Toledo's most infamous and closely watched court cases, as the public grappled with the possibility that a priest, someone they had trusted for so long, could have committed an act of such profound evil. For the Catholic Church, this was more than just a legal issue. It was a moral and spiritual crisis. As Father Robinson sat behind bars awaiting trial, the Church was left to confront the uncomfortable questions about how such a tragedy could occur within its sacred walls and whether it had unwittingly harbored a killer for all those years. By the time Father Gerald Robinson's trial began in 2006, the courtroom was charged with an eerie mix of anticipation and dread. For over 2 decades, the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl had remained an open wound in the community, and now, at last, the moment had come to seek justice. But what unfolded in that Toledo courtroom would not only focus on the brutal death of a nun, it would also pull back the curtain on darker, hidden corners of the Catholic Church itself. As Father Robinson stood trial, it became clear that this case wasn't just about a single act of violence. It was about secrets, rituals, and allegations that would forever stain the Church's reputation. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out its theory of the case. They argued that Father Robinson had not only killed Sister Margaret Ann, but had done so in a manner designed to resemble a religious ritual. They pointed to the cruciform pattern of the stab wounds on her body, suggesting that the murder was staged to reflect religious symbolism. The prosecution claimed that Robinson, in a fit of rage, had used an altar candle holder to carry out the killing. It was this item, they argued, that had left the distinctive wounds, and it was this item that tied Robinson to the scene. The expert testimonies were pivotal in supporting the prosecution's claims. Forensic experts detailed how the wounds matched the shape and size of the candle holder, linking it to the crime. Additionally, they emphasized the peculiar nature of the murder, pointing out the timing just before Easter and the religious elements that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. According to the prosecution, this was not simply a crime of passion, but a staged act meant to send a message, although what that message was remained open to interpretation. But as shocking as the prosecution's case was, what truly rattled the public were the revelations that emerged during the trial about the church itself. Whispers that had long circulated in the shadows were now brought into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Allegations surfaced of sexual abuse within the clergy, some of which implicated Robinson. Though these accusations were not directly tied to the murder of Sister Margaret Ann, they painted a grim picture of life behind the walls of the church, where power and authority were too often abused. More explosive still were the claims of satanic rituals allegedly conducted within certain religious circles. Though these allegations were never fully proven, they left an indelible mark on the trial. Witnesses suggested that there were darker forces at play, hinting at a hidden world where religious symbols were perverted for sinister purposes. These revelations, though peripheral to the murder case, fed into the media's hunger for sensationalism. The public, already grappling with the idea of a priest committing murder, was now faced with even more disturbing possibilities. Could there have been a cover-up within the church to protect Robinson? Had Sister Margaret Ann's murder been part of something much larger and more twisted than anyone had previously imagined? While the defense worked to dismiss these allegations as unsubstantiated rumors, the damage to Father Robinson's image and to the church's reputation was already done. For many, the trial was not just about determining Robinson's guilt or innocence. It was about reckoning with the deeper, more troubling truths that had been hidden for too long. The courtroom became a battleground not only for justice but for the church's integrity, and as the trial progressed, it became clear that this case was about more than a single crime. It was about the crumbling of an institution's trust and the exposure of secrets that had been kept for far too long. As the trial of Father Gerald Robinson unfolded, the defense team faced an uphill battle, yet they approached it with a strategy that aimed to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. From the outset, they framed Father Robinson as a man of God caught in the center of an unjust and scandalous accusation. Their goal was clear: to cast doubt on the evidence and to present Robinson as the victim of a deeply flawed investigation, tainted by sensationalism and public pressure to find closure after decades of uncertainty. At the heart of the defense's strategy was an attack on the forensic evidence that had been brought forward by the prosecution. While the advancements in DNA testing had given the case new life, the defense was quick to argue that these findings were far from conclusive. They pointed out the limitations of the DNA results, arguing that the genetic material found at the scene was not definitive proof of Robinson's guilt. The defense emphasized that the DNA did not directly link Robinson to the murder in any irrefutable way. Instead, they suggested it merely created an association that was circumstantial at best. Further, the defense sought to undermine the theories surrounding the murder weapon, the altar candle holder. They argued that while the wounds on Sister Margaret Ann Pahl's body might have been consistent with such an object, there was no direct proof that Father Robinson had wielded it. The hospital chapel was a space frequently accessed by many members of the clergy, staff, and even visitors. In the defense's view, the prosecution had failed to establish a clear link between Robinson and the weapon that was said to have been used in the ritualistic killing. Another key tactic in the defense's argument was to suggest that Father Robinson had been unfairly targeted due to the passage of time and the sensational nature of the crime. They painted a picture of Robinson as an innocent man whose reputation was being destroyed by unproven allegations. The defense urged the jury to consider the lack of solid evidence and the potential for bias in a case that had gone unsolved for so many years. They argued that the real killer could still be out there and that the prosecution's case was based more on circumstantial speculation than hard facts. Throughout the trial, Robinson maintained his innocence, a stance that was bolstered by the quiet but steadfast support of several members of the clergy. Despite the mounting evidence against him, some within the church refused to believe that one of their own could be responsible for such a horrific crime. These supporters, many of whom had known Robinson for decades, stood by his side, offering character testimonies that spoke of his years of service and dedication to the church. They described him as a gentle, compassionate priest, incapable of committing such an atrocity. The Catholic Church itself, however, was walking a delicate line. On the one hand, there were those within the church who supported Robinson and believed in his innocence, while on the other, the broader institution was struggling to respond to the growing scrutiny. The church, already embroiled in other scandals at the time, seemed to hesitate in offering full-throated support for Robinson. While it didn't outright condemn him, the church also didn't publicly rally behind him as it might have in the past. The weight of the accusations and the potential for more revelations of abuse and cover-ups left the church in a vulnerable position. For the defense, these dynamics worked both for and against their case. On the one hand, the visible support from certain clergy members helped to reinforce the image of Robinson as a dedicated servant of the church unfairly accused. On the other, the church's reluctance to fully back Robinson reflected the growing fractures within an institution that was already facing its own internal struggles. As the defense rested its case, it was clear that their strategy hinged on creating reasonable doubt. They needed the jury to question whether the evidence truly pointed to Father Robinson or if he was simply an easy target in a case that had gone unresolved for far too long. With his fate now in the hands of the court, Robinson's defense team had laid out their argument, but whether it would be enough to sway the jury remained uncertain. In the summer of 2006, after weeks of gripping testimony and intense media coverage, the trial of Father Gerald Robinson reached its conclusion. The jury, having carefully weighed the evidence presented by both the prosecution and the defense, returned with a verdict that would send shockwaves through the city of Toledo and beyond. Guilty of the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl. Robinson was sentenced to a prison term of 15 years to life, a sentence that marked the end of a 26-year-old mystery, but left the community grappling with the implications of what had just transpired. For the many who had followed the case, Father Robinson's conviction was a moment of grim resolution. The brutal murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl had hung over the city for decades, and now, finally, there was an answer at least on the surface. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read, a heavy moment of reckoning not just for those who had known Robinson, but for the broader religious community. Toledo had long been home to deep faith, with the Catholic Church standing as a pillar of moral authority. Yet here was one of its own, a man who had worn the collar and served at the altar, convicted of the cold-blooded murder of a nun. The reaction from the community was a mix of relief and disbelief. Many found it difficult to reconcile the man they had seen leading Mass for years with the figure now convicted of such a heinous crime. Some accepted the verdict as justice served, a painful but necessary closure to a case that had haunted them for so long. Others, particularly those who had been close to Robinson or the church, struggled to believe that a priest could commit such an act. Despite the conviction, there remained an undercurrent of doubt in some circles, questions that had never been fully answered, suspicions that perhaps the whole truth had yet to come to light. This doubt was fueled by the lingering questions that continued to surround the case. While the trial had established Robinson's guilt in the eyes of the law, it had also left several unsettling threads hanging loose. Was Father Robinson truly the sole perpetrator of this crime? Some speculated that others within the church may have had knowledge of the murder, or worse, had played a role in covering it up. The allegations of satanic rituals and abuse that had surfaced during the trial, though never fully proven, left a cloud of suspicion hanging over certain religious circles. These revelations had a profound impact on the public's perception of the Catholic Church, already dealing with scandals related to sexual abuse and institutional cover-ups. The Church's involvement in this case only deepened the sense of mistrust that had begun to grow in communities worldwide. The trial had exposed not only the possibility of evil within the clergy, but also the painful reality that the Church, as an institution, had perhaps turned a blind eye to that evil for far too long. Father Robinson's conviction also raised uncomfortable questions about how such crimes could be hidden within the very heart of religious institutions. If a murder of this magnitude could remain unsolved for over 2 decades, with whispers of wrongdoing brushed aside, what other dark secrets lay buried within the walls of the church? For many, the case symbolized a broader reckoning, not just with Robinson's guilt, but with the moral authority of the church itself. The legacy of the case continued to ripple through Toledo and beyond. While justice had been served in the eyes of the law, the questions of how deep the corruption went and whether there were more sinister forces at play within the church remained unanswered. The case of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl would forever stand as a stark reminder of the fragility of trust within religious institutions, casting a long shadow over the faith of those who had once placed their belief in the purity of the church. For Father Gerald Robinson, his conviction marked the final chapter of his public life, but for the community and the church, the case left behind a legacy of unanswered questions and a deep, lingering sense of betrayal that would take years, if not decades, to heal. The conviction of Father Gerald Robinson for the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl marked the end of a long and painful chapter in Toledo's history, but the broader implications of the case reached far beyond a single city, touching on deeper questions of faith, trust, and justice. At its core, this case shattered the illusion that places of worship are sanctuaries free from darkness. It forced both the Catholic Church and its followers to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil can exist even within the most sacred of spaces, committed by those entrusted with spiritual guidance. For the religious community, the case became a flashpoint for a crisis of faith. The church had always been seen as a moral authority, a place where people sought solace, comfort, and answers. Yet, here was a case that exposed the potential for corruption within its very ranks. Father Robinson's conviction left many questioning the integrity of religious institutions, particularly as allegations of abuse and cover-ups within the church became more widely known. The trust that had been so foundational to the church's relationship with its followers was deeply shaken, leading to a reckoning within not just the Catholic Church, but religious institutions as a whole. Culturally, the case became a touchstone for discussions about justice, especially when it involved institutions with immense power. In the world of true crime, this case gained notoriety as one of the rare instances where a member of the clergy was held accountable for a crime of such magnitude. It highlighted the challenges that arise when investigating crimes within closed systems, whether those systems are religious, political, or social. In many ways, Father Robinson's conviction was a victory for justice, a reminder that no one, no matter their position or status, is above the law. The true crime community continues to reflect on the lessons learned from this case. It serves as a reminder of the importance of forensic advancements in solving cold cases and the vital role that persistence plays in the pursuit of justice. The reopening of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl's murder after decades of stagnation gave hope to families of other unsolved cases, proving that time does not always erase the possibility of finding the truth. But perhaps the most significant lesson from this case lies in the delicate balance between faith and justice. Religious institutions often operate on trust, an unspoken belief that those in positions of spiritual authority are beyond reproach. This case shattered that belief, showing that blind faith, when left unchecked, can allow darkness to fester unnoticed. It called for a more critical examination of the systems we place our trust in and the individuals who operate within them. As we reflect on Sister Margaret Ann Pahl's life and legacy, it's important to remember the person behind the crime. She was a devoted servant of her faith, a woman who dedicated her life to caring for others and living out the values of her religious beliefs. Her brutal death was a violation of everything she stood for, a tragedy that left a scar on the community she served. While the case has been defined by the shocking betrayal of Father Robinson, Sister Margaret Ann's legacy should not be overshadowed by the crime itself. She was a woman of faith, kindness, and commitment whose life deserves to be remembered beyond the violence that took it. Father Robinson's conviction, while providing a sense of justice, leaves an unsettling reflection on the intersection between faith and crime. The idea that a man who had spent his life leading others in worship could commit such a heinous act forces us to confront the darkest possibilities within human nature. It is a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, must remain vigilant, especially in cases where the lines between faith and power blur. In the end, the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl stands as a sobering reminder that no institution, no matter how revered, is immune to the failings of the individuals within it. It is a story of faith betrayed, of justice pursued, and of the enduring legacy of a woman whose life, though tragically cut short, left a profound impact on the world around her.